You know that classic Thanksgiving story we all learn? The Pilgrims land in this huge empty wilderness and they just build a new world out of nothing. But what if that whole story, the very foundation of their journey, was actually based on a massive misunderstanding? Okay, let's peel back the layers on this and uncover the real story that's been hiding in plain sight, in the Pilgrims' own words. So when the Mayflower finally lands in November 1620, their leader, William Bradford, paints this really bleak picture. They see themselves at the absolute edge of the world, staring down a hostile, untamed land. I mean, behind them is this massive ocean separating them from everything and everyone they know. And ahead, only what he calls a savage hue. That was their headspace: total fear, complete isolation, and this deep-seated belief that they were utterly alone. But here's the thing. What they actually found totally contradicted their fears. The land wasn't some dark, impenetrable forest. It looked more like a park. Seriously, the woods had very little underbrush, there were fields already cleared and ready for planting. It was beautiful. But there was this one really unsettling fact. There were no people. And that right there is the central mystery. Why was this inviting, cultivated land completely deserted? So they start exploring, right, and they stumble upon their first major clue. Something so completely out of left field, it should have just shattered their entire worldview. They found a grave. In their own journals, they wrote about finding this grave, bigger than any they'd seen before. And, well, they decided to dig it up. Inside, they found all these carefully placed mats, bowls, and other items. You know, a pretty clear indigenous burial. But then they found the body. It was the skeleton of a man, and the skull still had fine yellow hair. A blonde man buried in an indigenous grave on the coast of Cape Cod. How was that possible? And that wasn't even all of it. Bundled right there with him were a knife, a needle, some pieces of iron, and a sailor's canvas jacket. These were not indigenous artifacts. They were obviously European. And just heart-wrenchingly, they also found the bones of a small child buried right alongside him. So the question becomes, who was this guy, and what in the world was he doing here long before the Pilgrims ever showed up? And if you think that's wild, the mystery only gets deeper a few months later when the Pilgrims got the absolute shock of their lives. The second clue wasn't something they dug out of the ground. It walked right into their settlement. I mean, can you even imagine their astonishment? An indigenous man walks up to them, all alone, totally bold, and greets them in English? This was Samoset. His welcome just completely upended their whole idea of being the first people to make contact in this strange, silent land. Turns out, Samoset's story blows the lid off a world the Pilgrims knew nothing about. He wasn't even from around there. He was from what we now call Maine. And he tells them he learned his English from the fishermen, English fishermen no less, who'd been coming to the coast for years to catch and dry codfish. This guy knew the names of fishing captains. He was totally familiar with Europeans. And this familiarity allowed him to solve the biggest puzzle of all: why this beautiful, park-like land was so eerily empty. So what did he tell them? And here it is. This is the key. Samoset explained that the very place they had decided to settle, a place his people called Patuxet, had been totally wiped out by a horrible plague just a few years before they got there. An entire society had just vanished, leaving behind their homes and their cleared fields. The Pilgrims hadn't found a wilderness. They had stumbled upon a graveyard. So Samoset's story just completely flips the script. It reveals that the Pilgrims weren't pioneers stepping into some untouched continent. Nope, they were actually late arrivals to what was a very, very busy coast. To really get this, we've got to rewind a bit. Back in the 1500s, there was this fishing revolution in Europe that pushed British fishermen farther and farther across the Atlantic. By the early 1600s, they had set up seasonal camps all along the coast of Maine to dry their massive catches of cod. And it was this constant contact that, somewhere between 1616 and 1619, unleashed a devastating epidemic. The Mayflower shows up in 1620, right after the worst of the devastation had already passed. Now, that extraordinary plague, Samoset mentioned, well, it wasn't just some random sickness. It was a biological catastrophe of a very specific and truly horrifying kind. It's what historians call a virgin soil epidemic.
Basically, what that means is the indigenous peoples of the Americas had zero immunity to European diseases like smallpox or the flu simply because they'd never been exposed to them before. So when those germs arrived with the fishermen, the population was completely defenseless. Think about how the world felt at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you get a small sense of it. The result was just unimaginable. The mortality rate in some of these coastal villages reached as high as 90%. Let that sink in. Entire communities were just gone. Leadership, knowledge, families, all wiped out in a flash, leaving behind that empty, park-like land the Pilgrims would later find. And right there, in that gap, the gap between what the Pilgrims thought they saw and what had actually happened, that's where one of America's most powerful foundational myths was born. So on one hand, you have the Pilgrims' take. They saw this empty, prepared land, not as a tragedy, but as a divine miracle. They truly believed God had literally cleared the way for them, which proved they were special, that this was their promised land. And then you have the historical reality. They were settling on land that had been cleared and farmed by a civilization that had just been decimated by diseases brought over by other Europeans. I mean, you have to remember, this was way before anyone understood germ theory. They had no concept of viruses or bacteria. So, from their deeply religious point of view, seeing a beautiful, fertile, and mysteriously empty land could only mean one thing. It was an act of God, a sign that they were on a divine mission. And as historian Heather Cox Richardson points out, this specific interpretation had massive consequences. This idea that America is a specially chosen land set aside by God for its chosen people, it didn't start with the Founding Fathers. It began right there, on the shores of Patuxent, with a group of survivors who mistook a horrific tragedy for a divine blessing. So it leaves us with this really powerful question. The story of the empty wilderness became a core part of the American identity, and for centuries it was used to justify expansion and a sense of exceptionalism. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other foundational stories do we tell ourselves? And how does uncovering the truth behind them change how we understand who we are today?